Hello, hello. Thank you all for being here. Greetings. Welcome to today's webinar, Beyond Compliance, Reducing Friction to Improve Efficiency, Team Performance and Financial Outcomes in Veterinary Practice, hosted by Cubex. I am Yasmin Stevens, Marketing Manager at Cubex, and I'll be serving as your host for today's webinar. It is my honor to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Emily King. She is the founder of the All-Star Veterinarian Clinic, a University of Tennessee graduate, and a Carmel native who chose to bring high-quality veterinarian care back to her community that raised her. Beyond the clinic, she's built a genuine following across Instagram and TikTok, where she connects with pet owners and veterinary professionals through education content, real cases, and the kind of personality that makes people actually stop scrolling. What draws us to Dr. King isn't just her clinical background. It's her focus on what happens behind the scenes, building efficient teams, reducing operational friction, and creating hospitals that are financially healthy and not just clinically excellent. That is exactly why we are here to talk about today. Dr. King, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me today. I so appreciate being here. I have to laugh because I really try to prepare really well for the technology side of these things, and then I'm always throwing a curveball. And so it's my fault that we're running a few minutes behind because my systems and computers and all the stuff is just giving me trouble today. So I apologize keeping everybody waiting, but I'm excited to talk about this topic today because I feel like it is a way to practice being intentional and forward thinking when operating and running our clinics and our practices. And I think that operational inefficiency, if you will, kind of creeps into our practices slowly. And I think as I've thought about this presentation, it's probably because at the origin of most clinics, they're very small, right? We all start out as very small businesses and maybe 5, 7 employees, or and so as we grow, we kind of start to normalize inefficiency, or maybe it's this that we just don't know about it or how to address it. But no matter really, honestly, the reason for how it gets into our practices, the end result's the same, and that is that it kind of wreaks havoc for us. And the other reason I like to talk about this topic is that it doesn't require a huge lift in order to fix these things. It just requires some thought and to recognize when they're there. Okay, next slide, Scott. Okay, so let me start with a confession, because there was a period of time at All Star where, and I genuinely thought that we were doing a pretty good job operationally. I think that if you asked anybody in the practice, they'd say they felt pretty good about everything. And I thought, that we were really doing a pretty good job. The team cared, the medicine was good, clients were happy, and people were working hard. So from the outside, things looked really successful. Next slide. But what I slowly started to realize over time was that we kind of had normalized a level of inefficiency that nobody was really talking about anymore, because it's simply become how we do things, right? You hear that phrase a lot. And I think this is where a lot of veterinary hospitals live. I don't think we live in total dysfunction, like where you're, in a disaster situation all the time, but you're kind of like in this constant state of low grade operational friction. At least we were. And it's kind of what we ended up calling like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And I think everybody kind of knows what I mean when I talk about the instances of you're walking around trying to find where maybe somebody set down the drug basket, right? Move the controlled drugs, or you're tracking down something like atropine or Dex SP, and someone's like, I put it somewhere, right? And we can all agree that in veterinary medicine, the phrase, I put it somewhere safe, is probably one of the most terrifying sentences in the entire hospital. And I remember one day at All Star, we had this moment that honestly probably should not have been that funny, but now looking back on it, it kind of is. We were trying to find a controlled medication that had apparently been put somewhere safe, as the person said. So now we had 3 technicians, right, looking in different drawers, somebody checking the surgery suite where they last saw it, somebody else saying, man, I swear I saw it earlier. And another person then trying to reconstruct the timeline of like when it was last used. It was like kind of we were doing our own little criminal investigation at the time. Meanwhile, you have the patient waiting, the doctor's waiting, and everybody's stress level is starting to climb over just one bottle of medication. And I remember thinking afterward, man, like how much emotional energy did we just burn in 10 minutes because the system relied entirely on human memory? And that moment really stuck with me because nobody involved was lazy or careless. The system had just created unnecessary friction. Next slide. So over time, I started realizing that friction doesn't show up randomly. It tends to fall into four categories or buckets, kind of how I see it. And once you can name them, though, like once you start recognizing this is what's happening, you're going to start seeing it everywhere in your own building. So the first bucket, missing information. Nobody wrote it down or the documentation's incomplete. So the next person has to reconstruct what happened. So for example, again, controlled substance logs with blank fields, or maybe patient records updated after the fact, coming in the next day, to finish patient records. Inventory counts that don't match what's actually on the shelf. Those are all examples of missing information. Missing access. So the person who needs something can't get it without interrupting someone else. So we at the clinic had one key for the controlled drug cabinet. And when, we had so much trouble tracking it down that we ended up, what did we do? Just leaving it in the controlled drug cabinet. Not ideal, right? So, or you have one person who knows the login for this particular system, or one computer in the back that runs a particular system, right? Those are all examples of missing access. Or missing accountability, another bucket. There's no clear owner, no clear expectation. It's just that somebody usually does it, which means sometimes nobody does it. So drugs that get pulled but not charged for because the process was unclear, or counts that get done when someone remembers instead of like on a regular schedule. And then the last bucket is missing clarity. So people interpret a process differently because it was never explicitly defined. So for example, 3 technicians handling controlled substance documentation differently, or surgery check-ins, they all do it different, or lab callbacks, it's all being done different. So now you have 3 different ways of doing those things. And everybody's convinced that their way is right? So if you multiply that now, as a clinic scales and grows, you can imagine the type of inconvenience that can create. So every friction point in your hospital can be traced back to typically one of these 4 buckets. And the dangerous part, as I was saying earlier, is that hospitals have adapted so thoroughly to their friction that they don't see it anymore. It's no longer visible. Next slide. So I want you guys to take 60 seconds right now, and I want you to write down 3 processes in your hospital that require the most workarounds. The ones where your team is always improvising, they're compensating, or they're hunting for something. And I don't want you to overthink it. The first 3 things that typically come to your mind are the right answers. So I'm going to give you 60 seconds here, 45 maybe, because I bet there's a lot of them popping into your head. So I'm just going to give you a second here, write them down. All right. Those items that you just wrote down, those are your hidden leaks. And we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so giving you a framework for seeing them differently so that we can fix them. Okay, next slide. And every hospital really has versions of all of these stories happening every single day, right? 3 different people interrupting each other because nobody knows who already gave something, handwritten logs, missing information, a technician having to stop what they're doing 4 separate times during a dental because they're hunting down inventory, they're getting signatures, or they're correcting something on a sheet, or they're trying to figure out if something was charged already. Nobody typically stops and says, wow, the system is terrible. And that's because it happens gradually. And the dangerous thing about gradual dysfunction is that eventually it starts to feel normal. So for me, the realization of we're spending an unbelievable amount of mental energy compensating for systems that should be supporting us, that was the shift for me. That was what made me change how I thought about things. Because up until that point, I think I really viewed operational inefficiency mostly as an inconvenience. It's like, yeah, we're inconvenienced each day, but that's just the way life is. It's something annoying, it's something frustrating. But what I eventually understood was that operational friction, it's not neutral. It's costing me things. So it's costing time, it's costing energy, it's costing trust, it's costing money, and eventually it's going to cost culture. Next slide. Most veterinary practices aren't struggling because their teams don't care. I want to make sure that I say that because they're really struggling because people are operating inside systems that create unnecessary friction all day long. And the hard part is that veterinary medicine tends to reward people for working around broken systems instead of fixing them. And I did this all the time. Meaning, for example, we praise the technician who always is able to figure it out. We praise the manager who kind of keeps everything together each day. We praise the doctor who stays 2 hours late cleaning up operational messes. And after a while, hospitals become dependent on heroics instead of structure. But heroics are exhausting, and also they're not scalable. So you can't grow your practice in that mode. Next slide. So I would say that most operational problems also don't announce themselves very loudly. They don't walk into your building looking like a disaster, right? Most of the time they show up disguised as small inconveniences that everybody has quietly adapted to. And that's what makes them so dangerous. So honestly, a shocking amount of veterinary medicine still operates on what I call the hopefully Karen remembers system of workflow management. And that's when every hospital has that one technician, right, or manager who somehow knows where everything is. They remember everybody's habits. They catch all the mistakes before anyone else sees them. And they basically keep the entire operation functioning through sheer force of will. We all have that person where you're like, oh man, if I had 10 more of these people, we would be, a force worth reckoning, right? I had a technician like that at All Star. She was incredible. Everybody trusted her because she could fix almost anything operationally. But one day she took a vacation and it felt like you kind of had removed a load bearing wall, right, from the clinic. Suddenly, nobody knows where things are. Nobody knew the workarounds or the shortcuts. People were asking, like, wait a minute, how does this work again? Or what do we normally do in this situation? Or where's that form kept? Everything was functioning beautifully right up until that person wasn't there. And that was really humbling, a really humbling leadership moment for me because I realized we did not actually have a strong system. We had a strong person that was compensating for my weak system. And those two things aren't the same thing. And that realization changed the way I viewed operational leadership because I think I started to recognize how often teams were surviving through individual heroics instead of sustainable systems. Next slide. What is interesting is that most hospitals don't even realize really probably how much energy they're burning simply just trying to maintain the current state. I mean, if you think about how many moments during the day require unnecessary mental effort, it's staggering. Here are a few examples, like trying to remember if something was already logged, double checking whether a medication had already been pulled, stopping patient care to find somebody with a key, searching for inventory, correcting handwritten mistakes, interpreting other team members, or interrupting, I should say, other team members to ask where something is, trying to reconstruct what happened because documentation was incomplete. And none of these, like as individual little items, right? None of them are catastrophic, but collectively, they create what we call cognitive overload. And cognitive overload matters because veterinary medicine is already just it's mentally demanding before operational inefficiency ever even enters the picture. And this is why I believe that operational systems are actually culture systems, whether we realize it or not, because systems shape the emotional experience that our employees have. And a chaotic system creates tension. An inconsistent system creates distrust, and a friction heavy system creates burnout. Meanwhile, of the opposite end of the spectrum, clear systems create confidence, they reduce decision fatigue, and they allow people to focus more of their energy on patient care instead of operational survival. And once you start viewing operational systems through that lens, then you can begin asking different questions. So instead of like, how do we get people to work faster? Instead, you can start to say, why does this process require so much effort in the first place? And that's kind of the lens that we're going to use for the rest of today's session. Next slide. Before diving in, I'd like everybody just to make a mental note, like how many of you guys have had a missed medication charge this week alone? Or how many of you have had a controlled substance count discrepancy in the last 90 days? I want you to kind of keep those numbers in mind because we're going to explain why those happen so consistently. So now that we've talked about operational friction as a concept, I want to break it down into 4 specific areas where I consistently see veterinary practices quietly leaking performance, energy, and profitability. And again, not catastrophic failures. Most hospitals are filled with hardworking people doing the absolute best they can. But when friction becomes normalized, these 4 leaks show up over and over again, whether we recognize them or not. Next slide. So 4 leaks, here they are. The first 2 we're going to talk about are the time leak and the trust leak. So the time leak is probably the easiest one to recognize because everybody feels it all day long. This is workflow inefficiency. So the constant stopping and starting, the interruptions, the searching, the retracing steps, the duplicate documentation, the waiting, the bottlenecks, right? They suck time. Their time sucks. One of the places this shows up most commonly is around controlled substances and inventory workflows. So think about how many touch points sometimes exist just to administer one medication. So for example, somebody has to locate it. We're talking about a controlled drug specifically. Someone has to locate it, unlock it, pull it, document it, verify it, charge for it, log it, correct the count if something was entered incorrectly, and then track down somebody if there's a discrepancy. All of those things are time sucks. Now, you multiply that small interruptions across an entire day inside a busy practice, what ends up happening is that technicians and doctors spend enormous amounts of time managing the process surrounding medicine instead of actually practicing medicine. And this is why I said earlier, like, I think that this kind of just shows up gradually because we start small and we're not really busy when we open a practice. And so you're like, you don't recognize that time is being sucked out. But now once you're busy, it becomes a stressor for sure. And I'd say another thing that's fascinating to me is that many teams no longer even notice how much time is being lost because they've adapted to the inefficiency. So, and this is why I often say we don't notice broken systems until we've normalized them, or once we've normalized them. And that just happens slowly over time. The second leak is the trust leak. This one's really important because trust inside a hospital is often tied directly to system reliability. So when systems are inconsistent, people stop trusting the process. Maybe counts don't match consistently, or maybe medications are difficult to track. Maybe documentation is incomplete, or maybe charging depends too heavily on memory. Like you got to remember what you just did and then get past that procedure in order to charge for it. Or maybe policies are interpreted differently by different people. So over time, those inconsistencies create tension, not because people are bad people, but because unclear systems force humans to compensate manually. And when humans are compensating manually all day long, mistakes increase. And then what happens, right? People start double checking each other constantly. And then leadership then starts to audit more aggressively because things are getting missed. And then team members become defensive. And then frustration increases. And eventually the emotional tone of the hospital starts to change. And that's because chaotic systems create emotional instability. Clear, consistent systems, on the other hand, create stability and therefore confidence. And if there's one thing both staff and clients crave, and that's stability. People feel safer when expectations are clear. And people communicate better when processes are consistent. And people trust each other more when accountability is built into the system instead of depending entirely on memory and perfection. And all of that, then, as you create that, basically is what drives an exceptional patient and client experience. Next slide. The third and fourth leak, the financial leak. This is the one that I think makes a lot of us uncomfortable as veterinary professionals because, many people have entered this profession to help animals, not necessarily talk about finances. And oh, dear God, like, especially in today's world, if you watch anything on social media, you're villainized for practicing financial stewardship, and it's extreme right now. And it's really frustrating to see. But financial stewardship matters because inefficient systems are expensive in ways that we don't always immediately see. So you're going to see mischarges, expired inventory, drug waste, over ordering or under ordering, inventory discrepancies, excessive carrying cost, lost products. All of these things are going to slowly erode profitability. And here's the important part: when systems are loose, your medicine becomes more expensive without anybody intentionally choosing for it to be. Then the energy leak, leak number 4. This may be the most dangerous leak of all because I think it impacts culture directly. So what I've found over time is that many hospitals, again, like I've said many times in this presentation already, you don't have lazy teams. They're not disengaged necessarily, but they're tired, right? They're exhausted. And that there's a difference. When systems require constant workarounds or people spending their entire day operating in reactive modes, constant interruptions, constant corrections, constant mental shifting, constant problem solving, that's all hard on them. And research on cognitive load in clinical environments consistently shows that interruptions and task switching don't just slow people down, they increase error rates. So then you can make the conclusion, right, that every time a technician stops a clinical task to hunt for a drug key or to correct something or to track down a missing, medication, they're not simply losing seconds. They're resetting their mental context. That same phenomenon that causes medication errors in human hospitals is present in our hospitals as well. The difference is that interruptions in veterinary medicine are often system generated and therefore considered preventable. And I think this is also where, burnout is a hot topic, right? And this is where burnout often begins. And it's not simply from the workload, but from sustained friction without relief. Because, I would sit and think about burnout, like why is burnout happening? Like, if I'm talking about my staff, I'm like, oh, they're only working 4 days out of 7. Or we have a great client base. I mean, like literally, we don't have mean clients. What is going on? And if you have sustained friction without relief, like within your system, it's a problem. It's going to create burnout. And what makes this difficult is that teams often blame themselves for the exhaustion, right? They think, man, I just need to work harder. Like I need to be more organized, or I need to handle stress better. When sometimes I think the bigger issue is that the system itself is demanding too much unnecessary energy from people all day long. And so then as that stacks up over time, it's really hard to see where the issue is. Next slide. So let's go back to the financial leak for a second here, because anytime I was working on the clinic and I could relate it to financial metrics and I could see something like visibly, like, oh my gosh, like then it made a lot of sense to me. So I want to go back to the financial leak for just a second here, because I want to go through this example so it hits home. So here's the math, what it actually looks like in a busy practice. So let's say you're seeing 40 patients a day, and even if there's just one medication charge that's missed per 10 patients, and that's really honestly based on the research, a conservative estimate, and your average missed charge is around $28, then that's more than $4,000 in missed revenue every single month. So over a year, that's $48,000, right? Not from fraud, not from theft, just from friction in the process. Now you layer in other things like what? Like expired inventory from inconsistent ordering, or drug waste, right? From poor documentation, or carrying costs from over purchasing. You start to see that operational inefficiency isn't a convenience problem. It's actually a financial health problem. And what really changed my perspective was deciding to track missed charges via a monthly report. So early on in All-Star's kind of lifespan, we started doing monthly reports, and I'm sure you guys do those as well. And then we would hand them out to the doctors. And I remember reviewing the reports at one point and realizing we had a surprising amount of mischarges tied to inventory movement. So, like during appointments and surgery, when inventory was moving around the clinic. Wasn't anything dramatic, just small things slipping through busy days, right? So, like a medication pulled during treatment, but it wasn't charged, or something used during a procedure, but wasn't documented. And so then it wasn't charged, or inventory that technically existed in the building, but somehow it disappeared into the veterinary medicine black hole. Like, where did it go? And then realizing that none of it's happening because my staff didn't care. It was just happening because they're busy. They're busy all day long operating inside inconsistent systems. And that will eventually cause you to miss things. And that became another mindset shift for me. I stopped viewing the issues as people problems, which it's really easy to do, right? To label people as the problem. And I really started viewing them more as workflow design problems instead. Next slide. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on something specific because everything we just talked about with those four converges in one area that carries kind of more serious consequences beyond efficiency or revenue. And obviously, Cubex is sponsoring this talk. And so, we're talking about controlled substances for just a second, but it can be very detrimental to the practice. And so I just want to spend a few minutes on this. Next slide. So controlled substance management is where operational friction stops being merely expensive and then kind of it's legally dangerous, right? So, that story that I was telling in the beginning where we had that missing medication at All Star and we laughed about it afterward. But let me tell you that what the same scenario looks like through a different lens, like if actually something, not so great happened. So, first of all, what the DEA actually requires: perpetual inventory log. Every controlled drug transaction, dispense, administer, waste must be recorded at the time it occurs, not at the end of a work shift or a technician's work shift or the end of a day, or not when things slow down, but at the time of use. You need biannual physical inventory. So a complete physical count of all Schedule 2 through 5 substances must be conducted every 2 years with a dated signed record retained. You need to use DEA Forms 222s for Schedule 2s. So every purchase of a Schedule 2, so ketamine, morphine, requires a triplicate order form with a complete record retained for 2 years minimum. You need to have wastage witnessed. So any unused portion of a drawn or open controlled substance must be documented and witnessed. And a blank witnessing line on a log entry is a regulatory violation, like full stop there. Discrepancy resolution. So count discrepancies can't simply just be corrected. They must be investigated, documented, and in cases of suspected theft or significant loss, reported to the DEA via a Form 106 within 1 business day. Now, if you think about that with my back when I started, a typical handwritten log system that I had in my practice, and then you ramp up the volume in said practice, like on a Friday, fields are left blank because somebody meant to come back and fill it in, or a wasted line was used with no witness signature, or a count that doesn't match and nobody can figure out, like when the discrepancy started because the entries are out of time order. So, again, these things just happen. It doesn't mean that the teams are bad. I'm describing what happens when good teams operate inside systems that can't realistically keep up with the pace of a busy hospital. Next slide. So now I'm going to go down just a little bit more of a rabbit hole for a second, because I don't think that myself that I probably understood the consequences of what might happen. So if you're caught in a particular scenario. So let me tell you what a DEA inspection might actually look like, just in case nobody knows. DEA diversion investigators typically arrive unannounced. They're going to ask to review your controlled substance logs immediately, going back to 2 years. They are looking for the same things your team overlooks every day. So unsigned wastage lines, time gaps between entries, count discrepancies with no documentation, and purchasing records that don't reconcile with administration records. And then If a practice is found to have systemic documentation failures, you don't just get a warning necessarily. The consequences can include suspension, or they can revoke your DEA registration, meaning you can no longer dispense controlled drugs. You can have significant civil penalties, mandatory compliance monitoring that's just going to disrupt your operations for like years. And in cases where diversion is suspected, then criminally it can be referred. So for a practice owner, a DEA registration suspension, that's a big deal. And for a practice being acquired or sold, if that's unresolved, if you have an unresolved DEA compliance issue, that can halt or kill the transaction completely. And so, this stuff is no joke, that's for sure. Next slide. And here's the point that I want you to take away from this. The 10-minute search we laughed about at the beginning of the session is not just an inconvenience, it's evidence of a system that cannot produce a reliable audit trail. And a system that can't produce a reliable audit trail, it's a liability. So, most practices never get inspected, and hopefully nobody ever experiences any of these consequences. But the ones who do really aren't the ones who deliberately cut corners. They're the ones who normalized friction, right? You adapted around it, you built workarounds, you just never built the structure that would have protected, that trail. And that's what I think makes this conversation so important. So with those questions that are up on the slide, how would you guys rate yourself honestly on a mental scale of 1 to 5 for each of the following 4 questions? I just want you to personally reflect on those as I ask them. So let's see here. Number 1, how confident are you that your controlled drug counts are accurate? Number 2, was every medication administered today also charged for? 3, if your most knowledgeable team member called in sick tomorrow, would the process hold? And then 4, if a DEA investigator arrived this afternoon, how would your logs hold up? And if any of those questions made you uncomfortable, that is useful information. You don't have to be like, oh my gosh, but it's a signal, right? Worth paying attention to, because the whole point of this conversation today is that once you can see the friction clearly, then you can start building the systems that actually protect your people and your practice. Next slide. So what do high functioning clinics do differently then? I can tell you this, not perfect. They're not perfect, right? They're just clinics that intentionally reduce friction over time instead of normalizing it. And the difference between a high function clinic and a struggling one is, it's rarely talent. It's almost always systems designed in a particular way and that are used consistently. So let me get specific about what that actually looks like in practices, because this is the part of the conversation that matters most for what you do when you analyze your hospitals after hearing this information. Next slide. So I want you to read through this, the before and after comparisons here. And again, I'm not trying to shame anybody. I was the before practice, and then I changed a bunch of stuff a long time ago. But I use this to make the differences concrete for you. So this is a composite from a lot of conversations I've had with myself, but then also other practices over the years. So, and I want you to notice what the after column doesn't do. It doesn't remove clinical judgment. It doesn't tell your DVMs how to practice medicine. It handles the administrative burden that was consuming their mental energy and creating compliance risk so that they can focus on the patient. That's what they do best, is practice medicine, and that's what they need to be doing. Okay, next slide. There are 3 things that these practices do consistently. And I use that word consistently because successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. It's probably one of my most favorite quotes of all time. I attribute it to Pat Summitt, the head basketball coach at University of Tennessee. It was so successful for so many years. And she's exactly right, because it's all the small right things that you do consistently over time that lead to the results that everyone else is chasing. And so these practices do consistently what others do occasionally. First, they reduce decision fatigue wherever possible in the practice. So if we're talking about medications, again, because this is a Cubex presentation, right? People know where medications are located. People know the workflow. People know the expectations. People know how discrepancies are handled. That clarity matters more than what most hospitals realize because, again, every time somebody has to stop and think, wait, how are we doing this again? You're consuming mental bandwidth, and mental bandwidth is a limited resource in veterinary medicine. You guys are faced with hundreds of decisions, micro decisions and big decisions all day long. So as much as you can pre-decide where something happens, it needs to be done. And that's how you reduce decision fatigue. Second, they standardize workflows without suffocating people. So good systems are not about removing critical thinking. They're about reducing unnecessary variability in the areas that do not need variability. And yep, I'm talking about SOPs, right? One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that struggling hospitals often mistake chaos for flexibility. They think, we're adaptable. Yeah, we're awesome. But eventually, adaptability without structure becomes exhausting because people are constantly compensating instead of operating efficiently. And then third, they protect time like it's a valuable medical resource because it is. Time affects patient care quality. Time affects communication quality. Time affects emotional regulation. Time affects team morale. When people are rushed all day long, everything deteriorates. Documentation, communication, patience, compliance, and eventually culture. Next slide. So, for example, if you consider a 4-doctor practice running on handwritten controlled substance logs and manual inventory tracking, their lead technician, 7 years in, for example, she knew every system, every quirk, managed the process almost entirely from memory. She knew when counts were off. She knew when someone had forgotten to log something. She was that strong person that kept everything together. Then she goes on maternity leave. And within the first week, there's a DEA count discrepancy that appeared that nobody could trace because the logs had too many gaps to reconstruct the timeline. And then the medical director had to spend most of the day trying to figure out what happened. Nobody suspected diversion. It was almost certainly documentation error, is what they were saying, but they couldn't prove it, which meant they couldn't rule out that alternative. And that was really uncomfortable for them and for everybody in the building. So when their lead tech returned, one of the first things she said was, I don't want to be the reason this place can't function when I'm not here. She was the one who pushed leadership to rethink the process. And then they moved into a structured system. And within 30 days, all the count discrepancies, zero, right? And for the first time, they could say with confidence that their logs could hold up to scrutiny, which gave everybody a high level of confidence. Next slide. One of the most concrete things you can do when you analyze your systems after hearing today's talk is to identify decisions that shouldn't have to be decisions at all. Kind of like what we were talking about on the previous slide. That's the first step. Reduce decision fatigue. Pre-decide as much as you can. So here's a small but real example of a process that was consistent and improved accuracy for us at Allstar. But if I'm being honest, it also slowly ate away at our energy. So we decided as a group that the paper log for the controlled drugs had to be filled out with every fill. So we stopped trying to do it like back in the day, at the end of the day or a shift change, right? So instead we built a protocol that the count was always happening at every fill, period. Like no interruption, no interpretation, no judgment required. You just had to do it. It always had to be done. And that was great because we had a consistent process that created accuracy. And we didn't have to spend a lot of time, making the decision, right? It eliminated 3 different conversations throughout the day. Like, did anybody do the count? Who's doing the count? When did we last count? Those were all small conversations that we were having, but they were adding up. And so by doing that, then we were able to fix that. And we were able to signal to the team that, this process is no longer ambiguous, which then allowed trust to be built into the system over time. So think about those processes in your hospital that are currently owned by like whoever can remember. So what is one process right now that depends entirely on one person's memory or initiative to function correctly? I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to think about that because everybody has that one person. All right. I want you to write that down because that really needs to be your first target if you're going to work on something. Okay. This is where leadership sometimes has to make an important mindset shift, right? Many hospitals unintentionally build systems around surviving volume. And I think this is such a valuable thought because instead of supporting humans, they are, and what I mean, I guess, by surviving volume is that your only measure of success is whether the appointment calendar, the schedule, got completed for the whole day. Like we did it, we did the schedule. Supporting people, on the other hand, means asking whether the systems you built to clear the schedule, to like actually accomplish the schedule, are sustainable for the people operating inside them, or whether you're quietly burning them out instead, one shift at a time, right? And those are two very different things. A system that technically functions, right, but emotionally exhausts the team is not actually functioning well long term. And that's what our process was. It was tiring, it was exhausting. So now we kind of get to the practical question. Well, like actually, how do you reduce all the friction then? Okay, I can see where it's at in my practice, but what am I going to do to reduce it? And the rule of thumb is anything that can be automated should be automated. So forward scheduling, through your PIMS, automatic callbacks generated at checkout. Those are just a few examples. And then obviously, again, we're talking about Cubex today. So, if we're talking about inventory management, Cubex is a huge thing that can help in terms of automation. And it's valuable because it multiplies your time, which I'm a huge believer in. Rory Vaden developed this concept called a focus funnel. And the first that you run everything, that all your tasks through this funnel, right? And the first thing that you have to ask about the task is, can it be automated? Can it be delegated is the second thing. And so like it is a fantastic tool, but automation, I think people worry about that term because they think the goal is to remove people from veterinary medicine, but that's not what we're talking about. The goal is really to remove unnecessary operational burden from humans so they can focus more fully on the work that actually requires human skill, right? Judgment, communication, and compassion. So veterinary teams are incredibly highly trained professionals, yet many practices still require those same professionals to spend large parts of their day performing repetitive administrative tasks that could be streamlined or standardized. So when we talk about automation, I want to move away from the idea that it's simply about technology or convenience. At its best, automation is really about reducing unnecessary cognitive load. So the number of things that people have to remember manually, the repetitive steps, the opportunities for human error, that's what automation can handle. So let me walk through 3 areas where structured systems and automation create the most concrete measurable value, because I think this is a conversation that stays a little too abstract sometimes. So let's talk about some concrete things. So next slide, Scott. We already spent some time on what DA compliance requires, but now let's talk about what supporting that compliance through a structured system actually means in practical terms. So area 1, compliance support, right? Real-time perpetual inventory. So every transaction is recorded at the moment it happens, not reconstructed later. Creating a log that is both accurate and time-stamped without requiring anybody to remember to do it. So, and then automatic discrepancy flagging. So instead of discovering a count mismatch at the end of a shift when the trail is cold, the system flags it at the moment it occurs so that it can be investigated right then and there and explained. Electronic witnessing and accountability. So wastage documentation requires a second user to confirm it. And that can be built into the workflow rather than relying on somebody remembering to go find somebody. User level traceability, instead of a shared logbook where someone pulled ketamine at 2 p.m. and the system records who accessed it, when, and for which patient. So it creates an accountability trail. And that's what the DEA auditor is looking for. And then an audit ready reporting. So your compliance documentation exists automatically organized and retrievable, not assembled under pressure when someone asks for it. So the difference between a handwritten log and a structured system like Cubex isn't just speed or convenience. It's the difference between a system that depends on human perfection under pressure, which is always going to fail, and one that builds accountability into the workflow itself. And then area 2, right? Inventory control and diversion detection. So one of the most uncomfortable topics in veterinary medicine is controlled substance diversion because nobody wants to really believe that that's going to happen in your practice, right? I mean, but the reality is that diversion often happens in practices with the best teams, the warmest cultures, really because those teams trust each other, right? And the systems are a little loosey goosey. But if you can use real time variance reporting through automation or structured systems, it means that when the quantity of a drug removed from inventory doesn't match what was documented for patient use, the system identifies the gap immediately. Now, the gap could be a documentation error, forgotten waste entry, a calculation mistake, or in a small number of cases, could be diversion. But the critical point is that knowing immediately means you can investigate it while it's kind of like still fresh in your head. Area 3, revenue capture. So earlier I put some math around mischarges. I guess now let me make that mechanism explicit because I think a lot of practices understand that mischarges are a problem without fully understanding why they happen so reliably. In a memory dependent system, charge capture works like this. A technician pulls a drug, they administer it, then at some point later, maybe then, but a lot of times later, if they remember, if they're not in the middle of something else, which a lot of times they are, if the system is intuitive enough to navigate quickly, they enter a charge. So every one of those steps in that process is a failure point, right? So in a system where the product is dispensed and charged, when that's integrated, then the sequence changes. So the medication's removed from inventory and the charge is generated at the point of dispense, just like that. It's linked to the patient record automatically. So the decisions of whether to charge for it or not, it's not left to the person under pressure. It just happens as part of workflow. And that is probably one of the biggest things that we've loved about using Cubex is that aspect. Next slide. So the drug's dispensed, the record's created, the charge follows. That's kind of the architecture around it. What used to depend on memory now depends on a process. And what used to be caught by a sharp-eyed manager reviewing end-of-day charges, right, in our monthly reports, now it doesn't slip through the cracks in the first place. Next slide. And I know what some people are thinking, like, oh, we can't afford this, right? Or we're not big enough for this to apply to us. And I think I hear that a lot. I was one of those people who said that in the beginning, and I just want to address it, briefly here for a second. First, the principle that structured systems outperform memory dependent system, it's true regardless of the tool. Doesn't matter. It could be your note taking and using scribing software, right? That's a really good example in today's world. There's no way you could put in as good of notes as scribing software. Just can't happen, right? Some of what we're talking about can be accomplished with better documentation, like clear SOPs and defined accountability, without any technology at all, though. If the only thing you do when you go home from the session and you do nothing else but define a standard controlled substance workflow and then hold your team to it consistently, you would see improvement. But I'm kind of lazy that way. Like, I really believe in that Rory Vaden focus funnel. If my task is to develop an SOP, if I can automate it, baby, I am automating it. Absolutely. Second, the cost of not addressing this is real. Every month of missed charges, every inventory discrepancy that goes unresolved, every hour your team spends compensating for operational chaos, those have financial values attached to them. So the question is not really, can we afford a structured system? It's, what is our current system actually costing us that we're not measuring? And this is where tools like Cubex enter the conversation, right? Not as the answer to everything or a magic fix, but as one example of how practices can reduce operational variability and improve accountability and support compliance and strengthen inventory management and decrease that friction that we were talking about. So the technology is a vehicle. The destination is a practice environment where your team spends less energy managing chaos and more energy practicing great medicine, taking care of their patients. Next slide. So as we start wrapping this up, I want to bring this back to leadership because at the end of the day, that's really what this entire discussion is about. Yeah, we talked about workflow efficiency, and we talked about compliance. We talked about inventory control and revenue capture and automation. But under all of that, it's a bigger question. What kind of environment are we creating for the people who work inside our hospitals every day? Because operational systems are not emotionally neutral. The systems inside your practice directly shape how work feels for our teams. And what I've learned over the years is that many leadership problems are actually system problems wearing a disguise. So we sometimes think that we have a communication problem when we have process inconsistency, or we think we have an accountability problem when we actually have unclear workflows. And we think people are disengaged when in reality they're just mentally exhausted from constantly compensating for the operational gaps and chaos. So leadership is not just about inspiring people, it's also about removing barriers, right? That make success unnecessarily difficult. And that process that we had at All Star, that we had in place early on for doing counts, although it was accurate, it was exhausting for the people to do. And at some point, leadership has to decide that friction is no longer acceptable. So, funny enough, I was preparing for this presentation, and I asked the person in charge of our inventory just the other day, and I said, "What if we didn't have Cubex anymore?" She said, "I would cry, and then I would quit." I was like, "Okay, well, we're not getting rid of it. I just wanted to know what your opinion was." So, and then lastly, I just had to laugh and include that because that's how important that decision was for that team member. And then implementing these strong systems are a sign of respect for the people doing the work, right? So by moving to automation, I was telling my staff, hey, I value your time, I value your energy. I don't want you carrying an unnecessary burden all day. I want the environment that you're working in every single day to make my mission and vision move forward. I want it supporting you. I don't want it fighting against you. And that's huge for staff. Next slide. So I want you to look back at what you wrote down at the beginning of the session when I asked you to write down 3 processes that require the most workarounds. And I want you to pick one of them that depends on one person's memory or initiative. And I want you to write that out. What should it look like if it were fully systemized? Every step, every owner, of the process, every time trigger, and then redesign it. That's going to be the start of your redesign. And then the next thing I want you to do is I want you to pull your drug logs and check. Are there unsigned wasted? I can't talk today. Are there lines that are unsigned? Are there time gaps that can't be explained? Or count entries that are clearly reconstructed rather than, in real time? And you're not doing this to catch anybody, right? You're doing it to kind of understand where your current systems break down under pressure. So what you find will tell you exactly where to start building better structures. And then lastly, I'd say sit down with your practice manager or medical director and estimate, even if it's roughly, what operational friction is costing you right now. And use kind of like that math I did in the beginning of the presentation. Add in inventory carrying costs. Think about hours spent on workarounds. I don't think very many practices put a number to this. And once you do, the conversation about investing in better systems, man, it changes completely. Next slide. So again, this conversation not really about software. It's not really about inventory or even compliance logs. Honestly, it's about decision makers deciding that friction is no longer acceptable and that our teams deserve better systems that support them. And also, I would say that deciding that your patients deserve professionals who aren't burning their best energy on administrative chaos. That's what our clients would love. Veterinary professionals should be spending more of their energy practicing medicine and less time managing this chaos. And the good news is, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, you have the ability to make it happen. And everything we talked about today is a place to start. So thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to throw it back to Scott.
Thank you very much, Dr. King. That was fantastic. And I took so much away from that conversation that I look forward to having and incorporating into my conversations with customers, quite frankly. You hit on a few things that I always talk about that I thought were really, really great. One of those being that, a strong person is not a strong system. And we talk about that a lot at Cubex. What I love about Cubex is it's the employee that doesn't take vacation. I think you mentioned it doesn't go on maternity leave, right? And just doesn't need that time off at the end of the night or anything like that. So we talk about that a lot. And then the other one I just want to point out real quick was you did a fantastic job of laying out what a DEA inspection looks like. And I recently had a conversation with a practice that actually got an inspection. It started with, well, who did you fire? Because that's how it happens most typically. All right. He laughed and said, how did you know? I said, well, that's kind of how it works sometimes. And then he went on to tell me that not only did he go through all the fantastic steps that all the steps that you laid out so fantastically, and all the work behind that, they were there for about a week and a half. But he said that there were unseen circumstances that he had really never thought of or had never really been taught about. And one of those was just the amount of patient care visits he lost because he had to spend his hours in the morning finding documentation, doing all this work for the agents that were there. And then he felt like when it was all said and done, that he must have ended up on a list because not within a number of 2 to 3 months, he had OSHA there, he had the state pharmacy board there, and everybody else that you can imagine. So it was much broader than just the DEA inspection, and it was a nightmare for him. So I always like to point that out for customers when I'm talking to them as well. So now is the time. I know we're kind of up against it, so apologies for that. But if there are any questions, we would be happy to take them. Does Cubex plan on ever adding a mobile plugin? We have mixed practice with multiple vehicles that go on remote calls. Happy to take that question offline. We currently do not. Certainly something that we're always looking at, as well as adapting all of our products to meet workflows. But there are workflows. We work with many mixed practices. I personally have many references. So we do have a couple different workflows that we work with our customers on to accommodate those vehicles that do go out in the field. So you'll see my QR code there if you want to schedule a call with myself. I'll be happy to kind of walk you through what that looks like and see if it's a good fit for your practice. Thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up because, again, I know that we're kind of a little bit past time. If you are interested, we do have 2 more upcoming webinars in the not too distant future. So on Tuesday, July 21st, we have Susan Mitchell, who's going to talk about just the culture of clinic well-being and safety. And Cubex is a partner with NOMV, or Not One More Vet. So if you're not familiar with that organization, please look it up. It's a fantastic organization that helps battle some of the mental fatigue that takes place within hospitals and the consequences therein. And then the second one will be August 20th, where 2 Cubex employees, Elizabeth Reed and Janelle Champeau, will basically talk about anything Cubex. So it's more of a roundtable where you get to ask all your questions about Cubex, whether you're a customer or not, and they will be there to answer them. So if there is anything else, please reach out to myself or somebody else at Cubex if you've had contact with us. And thank you again for your time. And Dr. King, thank you. That was, again, fantastic. And we really appreciate you taking the time today to walk us through that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.